autobiography, Mein Leben, and let's say right off that that's a volume that needs to be taken with a grain of Saxon salt. Wagner tells us how he and his wife Minna and his big Newfoundland dog, Robber, fled angry creditors in Riga overland to northern Germany, and then proceeded oversea via merchant ship bound for London, till a storm blew them off course, and they put in for shelter at Sandvika in Norway. Wagner remembered how enormous granite cliffs echoed with the shouts of the men casting anchor and furling the sails. The sailor's song he heard then eventually became this. Wagner tells us it was from those sailors on that voyage that he heard the story of the Flying Dutchman. How a defiant skipper once shouted into the blast that he would round the Cape of Good Hope even if he had to sail the sea till Judgment Day. How Satan heard him, wrote the compact in thunder and sulfur, and kept him from rounding the Cape, kept him in fact forever on the sea, longing to die, awaiting judgment, suspended between heaven and hell. That sounds like an old sailor's yarn, but in fact, in Wagner's day it was relatively new. Something of it may have derived from accounts of Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape centuries before, and of course there were elements in it of Faust selling his soul to the devil, and of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, condemned to life in death on a phantom ship. But the Flying Dutchman himself appeared in print only a few years before Wagner took that perilous sea voyage. The Dutchman seems suddenly to have emerged, along with Dracula and the Frankenstein monster, in the 19th century, as if to prove that new myths could still surface in an industrial age. The three 19th century monsters have something gothically romantic in common. They are all frightening figures, relentlessly striving for a redemption that always escapes them. The Flying Dutchman is a sailor's image of a damned soul, doomed to sail the sea till the day all mankind ascends to judgment, never to rest, never to die, till he passes into the void and is annihilated. In the new Metropolitan production, he is captain on a voyage of the damned, bound forever in a seascape of snow and ice. Wagner gave that condemned man, in his longing for release, this theme. Usually introduced by that most romantic of chords, the diminished seventh, and followed by the pounding of the surf. The Dutchman was a figure that would have haunted the composer even if he had learned of it in less dramatic circumstances. The young Wagner was a romantic in the Gothic sense. As a boy, he used to wake up screaming, imagining that objects in his room were alive. As a young man, he loved Weber's Freischütz with its wood devil, and Marschner's Vampire with its Dracula story. As a fledgling conductor, he knew those scores well. He also knew what it was to be lonely, rejected, and in flight. After that harboring in Norway in 1837, he was soon at sea again, passing through still more violent storms to London, and then across the Channel to Paris. There, he tells us, he endured humiliation and poor health and separation from his Minna, as, for a time, he was confined to debtor's prison. Meanwhile, he had found in a story by Heinrich Heine, a skeptical and cynical story he was to make archetypal and true, the suggestion he needed to complete the Dutchman's tale. Suppose that the haunted skipper is allowed ashore every 7 years to search for a woman to redeem him with faithful love. And suppose that on one of those shores he should find a girl who throws herself into the sea to redeem him. Wagner took the suggestion in Heine and shaped it into the first of his 10 myths in music, with the first of his Liebestod endings, and the first of the lonely heroes that came to be figures for himself. Eventually he sent his Dutchman with black-masted ship and blood-red sails, not to the Scotland of Heine's tale, but to Norway, into the same Norwegian fjord he himself had seen. Wagner tells us he drafted his scenario in a single week, sold it in desperation to the Paris Opera, and saw it handed over to a third-rate house conductor to be set to music. And finally, on a piano rented with his 500 francs payment, he composed in 7 quick weeks his own music for the legend. And with this new work, after 3 previous works for the stage, works that showed talent but hardly genius, Wagner found himself at last as a composer of operas. The cumulative experience of flight, danger, loneliness, humiliation, and unrewarded striving for recognition, and the projection of these onto the figure of the Dutchman, all of this released in him creative forces of such power that he himself wondered in retrospect. He seemed of a sudden to have acquired an uncanny ability instantly to evoke and sustain an atmosphere, to have found a kind of sixth sense in setting nature to music. In The Flying Dutchman, the wild sea all but floods and fills the score. As one conductor said, "Open the score, and a storm blows out at you on the instant." Later, Wagner admitted that much of the youthful work was imperfectly fashioned. He wanted an Eric somber as a northern headland, and a Daland who defies storms and dangers. But the music he wrote for those subsidiary characters is often unhelpfully conventional. On the other hand, the orchestral writing is amazingly confident. The choruses are the most full-throated in any opera by anyone to date. And above all, the soliloquies and duets of Senta and the Dutchman are taught with single-minded intensity. There, most of all, lies the strength of the work. In his 2 main characters, the intuitive Wagner, for the first time, touched on myth, which was to be the imaginative source of all his subsequent work. Wagner, in fact, brings 2 quite separate mythic figures face to face in this young man's opera, and he finds that they were all along meant to meet. He presents in Senta the eternal feminine, and in the Dutchman the mysterious lover. The eternal feminine, das ewig Weibliche, is one of the great themes of German Romanticism, immortalized by Goethe on the last page of Faust, and familiar too on operatic stages in the works of Weber and Marschner and Meyerbeer, and especially in Beethoven's Fidelio. The eternal feminine is the ideal woman who releases a man from the prison of his self by understanding him and accepting and returning his love. At the time he composed The Flying Dutchman, Wagner described her romantically as the redeeming woman who hovered before my vision, the quintessence of woman, longed for but beyond my dreams, ineffably womanly. The theme he gives Senta is accordingly consoling but elusive, leading onwards and upwards. The eternal feminine, in Goethe's words, leads a man upwards. She has the power to lead him out of himself, not just because she is physically desirable, but because she seems, from her intuitive understanding and acceptance of him, to be in touch with the sources of his being, the sources of his creative energies, the sources of wisdom itself. I think it can be said that an eternal feminine appears in all of Wagner's subsequent work. Elizabeth, and Elizabeth alone, understands Tannhäuser, and, like a star, leads him upwards. Brünnhilde, on her mountain top, tells Siegfried that she has always known him, that she is his self. Isolde appears in a vision to Tristan coming across the sea, walking on waves of flowers, leading him out of his unconscious. Eva, seen in dreams as Eve, the Muse, and the Virgin Mary, draws stanza after stanza of inspired song from Walter, and the ambivalent Kundry gives Parsifal insight with a kiss. Only Elsa, in Lohengrin, seems not to fit the pattern, and yet it was Elsa, of all Wagner's heroines, who awakened him to the real understanding of the eternal feminine. "Elsa," he exclaimed, "Elsa, the true feminine, hitherto not understood by me, now understood at last." With Elsa he first realized that the eternal feminine lies not without, but within a man's soul. She is that feminine aspect within a man that he must acknowledge if he is to be a complete human being. She is especially important for an artist, for a man's inner feminine is the source of his creativity. Then, in The Flying Dutchman, Wagner sets against his eternal feminine an archetypal male figure, the mysterious stranger, the pitiable monster, the beast with whom beauty is fascinated, the demon lover. He is a figure from folk tale who can also be found in such novels by women as, to cite only the greatest ones, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. He is often connected with the sea, for the sea is woman's great symbol of the unconscious. So in Ibsen's play, The Lady from the Sea, a woman cannot love the man she has married because once, at a lighthouse, she met a mysterious stranger in the mist who took her ring and threw it with his into the water. In his many guises, this demon lover from the sea, this tormented Heathcliff fronting the storm on land, is a figure ever searching, and Wagner gives him this obsessive musical theme. A less sinister appearance of this figure, and quite the best, at least to this classicist, comes in Homer's Odyssey, which is our oldest surviving combination of mythic archetypes and old sea stories, and a poem just possibly written by a woman, too. Wagner himself cited the Odyssey as a parallel to his Fliegende Holländer. You'll remember the scene. The hero Odysseus is cast ashore in a storm. He has lost his ship and lost his crew. He is half dead with exhaustion, and naked except for the barnacles that cling to him and make him impossibly ugly. He has no idea whether he has landed among savages or civilized folk. But it is a morning of uncommon freshness, and the delectable Princess Nausicaa is playing on the beach, tossing a ball to her serving maids. The cries of the girls at play awaken Odysseus. He, famous for his pluck and his quick mind and his ability to come out ahead in any adventure, resourcefully breaks off an olive branch to cover his nakedness. And as the serving girls flee, he delicately meets the greatest challenge of his career, touching the heart of the chaste and inquisitive princess. He guesses correctly that that very morning she wondered if she would ever meet the man who would be right for her. He doesn't tell her who he is, but he makes her feel that she is the only one who can save him, and she does. The mysterious lover from the sea represents for a woman the strangely enchanted, frightening, but pleadingly tender man who releases the creative instinct in her, though his background remains mysterious. So, in other Wagner pieces, Tannhäuser keeps his erotic past a secret from the chaste Elizabeth. Lohengrin withholds his name from the inquisitive Elsa. Siegmund comes as pseudonymously through the storm to Sieglinde as Tristan crosses the sea to be healed by Isolde. Walter keeps a chaste distance from Eva, even though he has stayed overnight at her father's house, and he approaches her discreetly in church. All the Wagner heroes keep their past lives mysterious when they ask for acceptance from the women who love them. The beginnings of these two Wagnerian figures, as old as Homer and wonderful archetypes for the male and the female, are in the opera we will hear today, when for the first time Senta, the eternal feminine, meets the Dutchman, the mysterious lover. She screams a scream of instant recognition, and Wagner follows that with a long, motionless silence in which the two look into each other's eyes with the realization that they have at last met their destinies. Freud and Jung have said nothing more about falling in love, finding in another what one most needs in oneself. When the opera is seen in this way, as each lover fulfilled in the other, and each holding the other in a sort of mythic trance, Senta's ballad at the center of the opera assumes great importance. It is not just a narrative to explain the background of the story. It is nothing less than an incantation. Staring obsessively at the Dutchman's picture and telling his story to repetitive rhythms, Senta conjures him up out of the sea. The Dutchman does not, as we might expect, ask that Senta admit him into her world on land, nor will she join him in his on the sea. Together they will create a world of their own. His redemption lies not in acceptance by any others, only in being accepted by her. And her salvation, once she has made her decision, lies nowhere but in fidelity to him. We last see them rising in the sun's rays over her forsaken harbor and his sunken ship. They have left their separate worlds behind, like Tristan and Isolde, like, to some degree, any two people completely in love. The Flying Dutchman is a frightening opera, not just for its powerful evocation of elemental nature in the overture, not just for the remarkable confrontation of human and ghostly choruses in its penultimate scene, but for the hypnotic vision to which its lovers surrender. Years before the much more accomplished Tristan, the Flying Dutchman affirms with equal conviction the reality of an ecstatic state and the comparative unreality of day-to-day existence. It tells us what it is like to be in love. To be in love is to create a world more real for you than the everyday world, one inhabited only by you and the one you love, and that redeems you from all your inner demons. Works of art tell us about ourselves, and preserve for us experiences that otherwise would be lost to memory. Something of the wind and waves of that fjord at Sandvika has been captured in The Flying Dutchman forever. Something, too, of the ecstatic feeling any one of us has when falling in love. And something, finally, of a young composer's passionate need to be discovered, accepted, and understood, of his need to silence the demons that howled and the creative energies that endlessly bounded and surged within him.
Thank you, Father Owen Lee.